The white man kills our game, captures our furs, and sometimes feeds his herds upon our meadows. And your great and mighty government, oh sir, I hesitate, for I cannot tell the half, it does not protect our rights. I say again, the government does not keep its word. This quote highlights Shoshone Chief Washakie's frustration with the United States government. Despite his long and steadfast support for the U.S. Army and government, he, like most Native American leaders, often got abused by the government when it was in their interest to do so. Welcome to the Rediscover the Winds podcast, a podcast by the Fremont County Museums. With museums in Du Bois, Riverton, and Lander, the Fremont County Museum System is committed to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the stories of Fremont County and the Wind River area. The unique artifacts found at our museums relate the history of central Wyoming with information which, in many cases, cannot be found anywhere else. With the Rediscover the Wind podcast, we hope to bring some of that history to you, wherever you are listening. Last episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we looked at the history of the Rocky Mountain fur trade and their annual rendezvous held from 1825 to 1840. At several of these mountain rendezvous, trappers often encountered Native American tribes whose territory they were encroaching upon. Though some conflicts arose between these two groups, in other instances, relations grew and friendships developed. Jim Bridger, a popular mountain man of the time and fur trapper, became very good friends with an eastern Shoshone Indian. Decades later, this same Shoshone Indian, now a chief known as Washakie, signed a treaty with the U.S. government to establish the Shoshone Reservation at Fort Bridger. This episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast will focus on the life of this great Chief Washakie. Chief Washakie is the most famous of all Eastern Shoshone leaders. He was a luminary figure, renowned for his diplomatic skills and his prowess as a warrior. His story is really the story of Wyoming. He lived through and contributed to the unprecedented change that happened in Wyoming starting at the dawn of the 19th century. When he was born, few, if any, white men had been in the Central Rockies. The Shoshone and other Native American people controlled the region, living their lives as hunter-gatherers as they had done for centuries. When he died, the area was part of the United States of America, crossed by railroad tracks and populated by hundreds of thousands of white farmers, ranchers, businessmen, soldiers, and miners. Washakie witnessed all of these changes, and through his leadership, guided his people through these unbelievable changes to their world brought on by the United States westward expansion. Known for his prowess as both warrior and statesperson, Washakie played a prominent role in the territorial and statehood development of Idaho, Montana, Utah, and Wyoming. He hunted and trapped with famous mountain man Jim Bridger and sat in treaty councils and negotiations with Mormon elder Brigham Young, as well as many military and government figures from the United States. He secured the Wind River Reservation as the homeland of the Eastern Shoshone. It is fair to say that Washakie is the most significant figure in the history of Wyoming, based on his life and actions. For most modern Wyomingites, the names of Chief Washakie, the Shoshone Indians, and the Wind River Reservation seem inseparable, yet it was not always so. The Eastern Shoshone Band of American Indians, for whom the Wind River Reservation was created by the Fort Bridger Treaty of 1868, is a collection of various bands of Shoshone and Bannock people who originate from Nevada, Utah, and Idaho. Washakie is still considered by some Shoshones as an outsider because he was not a full-blood Shoshone. Indeed, Washakie was of mixed tribal heritage. According to family history, Washakie was born to a Lemhi, or salmon-eater Shoshone mother from Idaho and a Flathead father from Montana. In an era before written records, Washakie's birth date is hard to pin down. His official date of birth is reputably either 1798 or 1804, but both are probably a bit too early. The Episcopal priest John Roberts, who served as missionary to the Wind River Reservation from 1883 until 1948, recorded the 1798 date of birth in the official church records. Washakie's gravestone, however, is inscribed with the 1804 date. This was done at the insistence of James K. Moore Sr., the reservation Indian trader, whose acquaintance with Washakie spanned the early 1870s until Washakie's death in 1900. Yet another opinion comes from Captain Richard H. Wilson, who was the acting Indian agent from 1895 to 1897. He thought that Washakie died at age 75, which would make his birth year 1825. Washakie's date of birth is only one of the mysteries about his origins. Another is, when did he actually become Shoshone? In 1930, one of his biographers, Grace Raymond Hubbard, gave this explanation. She believes that Washakie's place of birth was in 1798 in Montana, in his father's Flathead village. Hubbard, who derived most of her information in the 1910s and the 1920s from several of Washakie's sons, including Dick and Marshall Washakie, records that Washakie's family and village were attacked by Blackfeet Indians near the Three Forks area of Montana. This region, where the Madison, Jefferson, and Gallatin rivers flow together to form the Missouri, was prime buffalo habitat and well known to various Plateau and Northern Plains Indians, including the Nez Perce, the Flatheads, various Shoshone and Bannock bands, Crow, and the Blackfeet. According to Hubbard's informants, Washakie's father was killed in the raid, and Washakie, his mother, and his surviving siblings fled to the Lemhi relatives in Idaho. At a later date, his mother returned to the Flatheads, but Washakie stayed with the Lemhis. Then, during his adolescence, Washakie joined a passing Bannock tribe. The Bannocks, linguistically related to the Shoshones, were trading and hunting partners with them and frequently joined them on massed buffalo hunts in Montana and Wyoming. From the family stories gathered by Hubbard, she deduced that Washakie eventually joined a Shoshone band between 1826 and 1832. This band considered the Green River Basin area of southwestern Wyoming to be their homeland. Based on Washakie's own words about his life, unknown to either Moore or Hubbard, a more likely birth date is given circa 1808 to 1810. Washakie recounted part of his life story in an interview given to Captain Patrick H. Ray, who was the Indian agent at the Wind River Reservation between 1893 and 1895. Washakie revealed several interesting facts to Ray about his early life. First, Washakie mentioned that he was a good friend of the famous mountain man and explorer Jim Bridger, and that Bridger was only slightly older than he was. Second, Washakie said he was 16 years old when he joined the Shoshones. And third, he joined the Shoshones around the same time that he met Bridger. This information allows better analysis of Washakie's age, since Bridger's life is very well documented. Bridger was born in 1804 and did not enter the Shoshone country of western Wyoming and eastern Idaho until 1824. Washakie told Captain Ray that he and Bridger became good friends and spent a number of years trapping together. Thus, if Washakie was correct about his age when he met Bridger, then the earliest date for his birth would probably have been 1808 and most likely no later than 1810. This time span corresponds to Bridger's employment with William Henry Ashley's Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Company and with the first two fur trade rendezvous. Bridger's first winter camp in 1824 to 1825 was probably in the Cache Valley of Utah, through which flows the Bear River. That winter, Bridger followed the river to its outlet at Great Salt Lake and became the first known white person to have seen the lake. The following summer, he and his fellow trappers attended the first fur trade rendezvous that took place in the vicinity of Henry's Fork of the Green River in Wyoming. The next year, the event moved to the mouth of the Blacksmith's Fork Canyon in Utah. It is likely that Washakie met Bridger and also attached himself to the Shoshones sometime during the 1824 to 1826 period. Washakie talked about his hunting and trapping friendship with Bridger, but he also states that the two became good friends. This friendship proved long-lasting and heavily influenced Washakie's growth as a young Shoshone man, and later, Bridger actually became part of Washakie's family. In this time period, Washakie clearly casts his ballot with a band of Shoshone who claimed the Green River and Bear River regions as their home territories. This meant that Washakie lived in proximity for many years with the fur trappers and traders, learned their mannerisms and language, traded with them, and earned a reputation among the whites as a friend. Trapping and trading, however valuable these activities were to fur traders, were not enough to gain prominence within Shoshone culture. In order to do this, young men had to prove themselves in battle. So, during the same period that Washakie immersed himself into the fur trade, he also waged war on the Blackfeet, the people who had killed his father. His stories about his raids on the Blackfeet always start with a journey from either the Green or Bear Rivers. He specifically mentions 7 different raids. In the first, Washakie is still quite young, not yet married, and a follower of another leader. In fact, he didn't lead his first raiding party until his 4th attack. By the early 1830s, Washakie had matured enough and had achieved enough acclaim to marry his first wife. According to family traditions, this took place in either 1833 or 1834. One of his daughters, Mary Washakie, became Jim Bridger's 3rd wife in 1850. Washakie continued to maintain his hunting, trapping, trading, and warring activities from his home in the Green River, Bear River, and Cache Valley corridor throughout the 1830s and into the 1840s. The Shoshone bands that eventually became known as the Eastern Shoshones were under the leadership of several powerful headmen who reportedly massed over 2,000 Indians in their buffalo hunting forays to the plains of Montana and Wyoming. Fur trapper William A. Ferris identified 4 such leaders in 1831: Horn Chief, Iron Wristband, Little Chief, and Cut Nose. Ferris later reported that Horn Chief was killed by the Blackfeet in 1832, and that Cut Nose was the leader of Shoshones who intermarried and lived in a mixed Indian and white community in the Green River region. More than likely, this was the band Washakie was in. Making clear distinctions about Shoshone leaders proved impossible to white observers. To outsiders, it seemed as if certain leaders controlled thousands of people, but in reality, such men generally were leaders of specific events, such as annual masked buffalo hunts, rendezvous, or ceremonials such as the Sun Dance, and not as overarching rulers. Despite attempts to categorize certain leaders as powerful chiefs, Shoshones had long organized themselves into loose-knit family bands of various sizes. The economics of providing food and fodder for thousands of Indians and their horses acted against long-term gatherings. The economics of providing food and fodder for thousands of Indians and their horses acted against long-term large gatherings, and after an event, the large group dispersed into more manageable and smaller groups of 10 to 150 people. Each of these had their own designated leaders or headmen. In addition to the leaders identified above, the fur trappers noted other important or up-and-coming persons. For example, Russell called 3 young warriors, quote, the pillars of the nation and men whose names the Blackfeet quaked with fear, end quote. These 3 were Inkatushapap, Phippapantwatsi, and Washakie. Washakie, of course, refers to the person better known as Washakie, and Russell's mention of him in 1840 is the first documentation of his importance. Matthew Field named 2 other chiefs in 1843, Washaka and Unkatasara. Field said these 2 hunted in Crow Indian territory of the Big Horn Basin, and once again stated that Cut Nose stayed near Bridger's fort. On the other hand, Field's Washaka might also be Washakie. If we consider the account of William Hamilton, a young trapper who worked the Green, Wind, and Bighorn rivers in the mid-1840s, Hamilton camped for part of 1843 with Washakie and noted that he was leading hunting trips in the Crow territory of the Bighorn River. Taken altogether, at least 5 different men headed Shoshone groups during this time, with 2 of them, Cut Nose and Washakie, clearly known for friendly relations with trappers and traders. Men such as Jim Bridger used their trade relationships to foster the careers of their friends, including Washakie. In his 1849 report about the Indians in the region, Indian agent John Wilson noted that Washakie, Mono, Wishkin, and Apish, meaning big man, were all the main leaders. Wilson took his information directly from the reports by Bridger. Whether Washakie was chief or not to his fellow Shoshones, he quickly moved into that position in the eyes of white officials. The process started with Wilson's report in 1849. That same year, he asked Washakie to help solve an intertribal crisis over horse stealing between the Utes, Paiutes, and Shoshone. This was the first time the federal government officially recognized Washakie as an important leader, although an actual council meeting did not take place until 1852. Before the council could occur, however, an even more important meeting intervened, the famous Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. The government called this meeting to establish peace on the plains, which is to stop the intertribal warfare among the Mandan, Sioux, Crow, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Blackfeet, and other plains tribes, with the primary goal of providing a safe passage for emigrants traveling the overland trails. Jacob Holman, who recently had been appointed Indian agent for the newly created Utah Superintendency of the Office of Indian Affairs, thought that other tribes whose lands were affected by the overland emigrants should also attend the meeting. Holman sent Bridger to gather the Shoshones and bring them to the council. This was no easy task, as the site of the meeting on Horse Creek, about 30 miles from Fort Laramie, was squarely in enemy territory as far as the Shoshones were concerned. Moreover, the timing was off. It was August, when most Shoshones were on fall buffalo hunts. Bridger eventually found the band that included Washakie camped along the Sweetwater. Unfortunately for Bridger, the leader of the group was hunting buffalo and did not want to stop to attend the council. To sour things further, a raiding party of Cheyennes attacked a small group of Shoshone hunters near the camp, killing 2 and stealing horses. The few leaders who were in camp immediately mistrusted the upcoming peace council and argued for 3 days on the matter. In desperation, Bridger asked Washakie to take charge and resolve the issue. In Washakie's own words, quote, "I called in all the young men who had been to war with me," end quote, and also said, quote, "I was going to stay with the white men, and they must make up their minds to go or to stay." And they all said that they would stay. There were all a good many of them, end quote. Moreover, they elected Washakie to serve as their war chief. This election began Washakie's chiefmanship as far as the whites were concerned. 60 to 80 warriors followed him to the Fort Laramie and Horse Creek Council. There, the Shoshones made a triumphant entry, dressed in full regalia, and that reportedly started a scramble for weapons among their enemies who believed that the Shoshone warriors were going to attack. Despite their grand appearance, the Shoshones were excluded from official participation since the meeting was called for the Plains tribes only and not for those like the Shoshones who resided primarily west of the Rocky Mountains. For the next decade, Washakie clearly was the leader of choice from whom white officials such as Brigham Young, the head of the Mormon Church and governor of Utah, sought counsel and concessions. There were other prominent Shoshone headmen, chiefs in their own right, who led various bands, but Washakie was the primary leader to whom whites turned for guidance concerning most of the buffalo hunting Shoshones. As for Washakie, he had learned the intricacies of negotiating within the white world from his long relationship with Jim Bridger and other trappers and traders. He used these skills to obtain goods, supplies, food, and other presents from Indian agents and government officials to the benefit of his followers, who sometimes numbered as many as 1,200 people during much of the 1850s. At the same time, he also reined in his younger warriors from participating in attacks on the hordes of white immigrants who increasingly streamed through Shoshone territory on their way to California or Oregon. Washakie clearly honored the terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty, even if he was not an official signer, and he played on this friendship to whites to gain whatever advantages he could for his followers. The migrants who passed through his territory had a tremendous impact on Washakie's Shoshones. During the 1840s, Washakie was part of a band that headquartered around Jim Bridger's fort with forays onto the plains via the Sweetwater drainage to hunt buffalo. In the early 1850s, following his rise to a more prominent role, Washakie's activities still centered on Fort Bridger and Salt Lake City, where the Shoshones actively traded buffalo hides and other game pelts for goods and supplies. But by the mid-1850s, the continuous flow of white settlers through this area had disrupted life and hunting to such a great extent that he sought out areas where whites had not yet settled. Thus, while trading in Salt Lake continued to be important during their summer, in late fall, Washakie's Shoshones headed north to the Three Forks area of Montana for their buffalo hunts and where Washakie had gained his first prowess as a warrior against the Blackfeet. They traveled north, either up the Snake River drainage or further east up the Green River Basin. The band, whose members formed the majority of the plains-going Shoshones, apparently made this change in their geographical range from the mid-1850s through the early 1860s. This had a twofold purpose. First, it prevented factions within his band from raiding or killing white travelers and the Mormon settlers who now homesteaded these former Shoshone lands. And second, it could lead his people to buffalo in relative safety without violating territorial boundaries marked out by the Treaty of Fort Laramie. For the most part, this strategy worked quite well. Under the terms of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the Crows were given almost all the land now encompassed by today's Wind River Reservation. Thus, the Snake River or Green River routes to Montana usually avoided potential confrontation with the Crows, although the area near the western edge of Yellowstone and the region of Henry's Fork in northeastern Idaho was a kind of no man's land. In 1856, the latent danger erupted in a violent battle between Washakie's band and a large Crow group. This fight took place when Washakie's Shoshones were traveling south from Henry's Lake, according to memoirs of Elijah Wilson, a white boy who spent 2 years with Washakie's family during this time. Wilson said that over 50 Shoshones and 100 Crow warriors lost their lives, which was a tremendous loss of life and highly unusual in Plains Indian warfare. Wilson implied that the Washakie and Crow leader called a truce and both groups departed the scene. However, it is quite possible that this battle is the legendary story of the Battle of Crowheart Butte. According to the story, following a battle like the one described by Wilson, Washakie challenged the Crow leader to single combat, with the loser's people agreeing to retreat from the area. This event supposedly took place on top of Crowheart Butte, a monolithic tabletop mesa near the Big Wind River about 30 miles south of DuBois. Washakie emerged victorious, holding the heart of the Crow warrior, thus giving the mesa its name and adding another layer of mystery to Washakie's life. Wilson doesn't make it clear where the battle he witnessed occurred. He notes Washakie risked going into Crow territory to get better hunting for the spring trek towards Salt Lake, so it is possible that Washakie had traveled eastward from Henry's Lake, perhaps had crossed the northern end of the Teton Mountains into the region near the Yellowstone and Teton Park border, and finally traversed Togedy Pass, or another pass through the Wind River Mountains to descend into the Wind River drainage. Regardless of whether this event was of the Battle of Crowheart Butte, it did signal a period of increasing conflict with the Crows. At the same time, the Shoshone and Bannocks of Idaho began more frequent campaigns of armed resistance to the ongoing invasion of their lands by emigrants and settlers. As a result, Washakie began to lose some of his followers, especially younger warriors who disagreed with Washakie's continued assistance of friendship towards the newcomers. As early as 1852, Washakie had suggested to Brigham Young that land be set aside as a reserve for the Shoshones, but these talks never advanced very far, because Washakie insisted on a provision that food and goods be made available to the tribe on an as-needed basis. Perhaps in order to use his alliance with the government to carve out a niche for his people, as early as 1858, Washakie began to make overtures to white officials to set aside land specifically for the Shoshones. His first choice was for land along Henry's Fork, a tributary of the Green River near the Utah and Wyoming border. Later, he proposed a reserve near the Uinta Mountains of northeastern Utah. Like the initial talks with Brigham Young, Washakie's negotiations led to food, clothing, and goodwill, but nothing else. Washakie kept the peace as best he could. He went to great lengths to avoid conflict with the ever-increasing white population of the region and the more and more belligerent tribes surrounding him. Despite his best efforts, though, things were coming to a head. The Plains Wars between the U.S. government and tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were all on the horizon. Washakie spent the next part of his life trying to make the best choices he could for his people in an increasingly difficult environment. In a future episode, we will look at these efforts, the creation of the Wind River Reservation, and Washakie's life on the reservation, leading to his eventual death as the most revered leader of his people. That's it for this episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast. If you want to help keep this podcast up and running, please consider donating to the Wind River Cultural Center Foundation. Visit their website, www.windriverccf.com, for more information. To learn about our museums or to get in contact with us, please visit our website, fremontcountymuseums.com. Thank you for listening to the Rediscover the Winds podcast. I hope you learned something new and have a great rest of your day.